many people think that there is the truth, which suggests one single truth and one correct source of truth. I get the feeling from chatting to you and reading through your stuff that you feel like there can be multiple truths that are all simultaneously correct. What's your perspective?
I love that we're starting with a very easy question on a Friday morning after an intense week. Okay, multiple truths. What is my stance? I think that we live in a world where many of us either have components of our identity that we're trying to integrate and are trying to find ways so that those parts can be coherent, or there's a tension between who we are and perhaps who society expects us to be, and we perhaps are trying to suppress or hide those components. I think what often inspires me is recognizing that it's okay to be curious and ask questions about who I am and who I would like to be and how I can bridge the gap between those two components. And I think that's part of the journey that I've been on over the last, I'd say 6 years in particular.
Okay.
What's the gap between who I am or who I was and the more truthful version of myself. So what steps have I taken to get there? I think it's been a journey of, first of all, I would say like flattening a lot of structures that for me represented conflict.
Structures in your life?
Yeah, structures in my life that represented conflict. So I think when I say flattening, I mean having to ask myself questions about how does this structure put me on a pedestal that doesn't allow me to connect to another part of myself? And how can I get back to the foundation so that I can at least start to explore and have a dialogue between these different components of myself? And I think it's now that I have built that foundation, I can start to build systems whereby all of those different parts of myself can talk and be in dialogue with one another. Whereas in the past, it felt like there was no harmony. There was a part of me that was way up here, another part of me that was like at the bottom. And I feel like the journey that I've been on over the last, I'd actually say since going to Harvard, like since 2017, I've been on a journey of being able to, I think in some ways Harvard flattened my identity.
Okay.
Because it made explicit that there were parts of my story that in theory shouldn't coexist. It shouldn't make sense that I had a stutter in primary school, which meant that I was 168 times more likely to be excluded than one of my best friends who was a white girl. So as a Black Caribbean boy with a learning difficulty, I was 168 times more likely to be excluded from school, which could have changed the entire trajectory of my journey. It in some ways doesn't make sense, or it didn't make sense that I grew up in a very low-income family in a very deprived part of London, East London in particular, yet at the time was studying at one of the top 10 universities in the world and was about to go to another top 10 university in the world. Didn't make sense that when I was preparing for Harvard, I was working at an investment bank.
Didn't make sense according to who?
I think according to the narratives that I was exposed to when I was younger of what could be possible for someone who came from my background. And so I think going to Harvard meant that I had an opportunity to explicitly engage with and acknowledge all of the multifaceted components of my identity, the fact that certain members of my family could be going through quite intense housing disrepair cases with the local council. Yet at the same time, my whole campaign was about Stratford to Harvard, so social mobility. So I was simultaneously living through the benefits of social mobility while also suffering the consequences of it vicariously through those related to me. And I think going to Harvard meant that I had to confront all of those things head on. And I think studying in the US, living in the US, something about the notion of the American dream acknowledges that you can have these plural identities, and part of the challenge is making sense of them. And I think going to Harvard was the first time that I could explicitly pause and appreciate that there were many people with plural identities who had allowed their sense of self to grow and mold and flatten, and who were willing to pursue all of their various interests without having to fit within a box. And I think that was very empowering for me. So to give you an example, one of my close friends, who's a non-binary person, they were involved in the gospel choir. They were involved in queer societies. They studied contemporary jazz alongside astrophysics. And I just remember thinking, wow, I love how all of these things, all of these components of that person's identity were so different, yet they had found a way to integrate them and find coherence within them, which I imagined wasn't an easy process. But I loved that at Harvard in particular, people were willing to engage with that process of there being multiple truths, multiple sides of someone's identity, many of which might come into conflict at different moments. And I think that gave me the audacity to flatten a lot of my identity structures, and then almost start the process of knocking them down, and then building them back up again. And I think 6 years, well, how many years later? 8 years later, I look at where I am in my life now, where I am actively going to church again, given that faith has been a big part of my life. I wouldn't say I'm religious, and I've never said I'm religious. I have a strong faith and relationship with God and a strong kind of spiritual connection.
Yeah, I feel that. I'm similar.
But I've never subscribed to the view that religion is about rules and regulations and fitting within a certain box. So I was a youth leader for a significant amount of years throughout my later teenage years and early 20s. But then as I started to feel comfortable enough and safe enough to embrace and understand my queer identity, I realized that I needed to take a step away from the church context so that I could start rethinking what faith and queerness could mean to me and how I could allow those things to coexist. So to answer your question, I think I'm on my journey of finding coherence between these different parts, but I've made so much progress, and I think part of the progress involved having to flatten a lot of these structures that, as I said, put me on pedestals and stopped me from being able to have a dialogue between these different components of my identity. And I had to flatten them so that my queer identity could communicate with my faith, could communicate with my ambitious identity, could communicate with the fact that I come from a Caribbean household family, could communicate with the fact that I have studied at very prestigious universities around the world. It will turn off in a minute.
Okay. I'm just saying, is that in this room? Yeah.
Could connect with the fact that I have friends who come from very wealthy billionaire families, and I have friends who come from very low income, impoverished families, and I have friends across the whole spectrum. And I think I had to flatten all of those so that I could make sense of them, so that they could be in dialogue, and so that I could start to build them up on my own terms. And I think that's kind of where I am now. I live in the same area where my family grew up, but my family, like on my mum's side, grew up in council housing on an estate, and parts of that estate have been knocked down and are going through regeneration. And I now live in one of the like luxury towers on that former estate. And I think
what a full circle moment.
I think it's really significant because my mum's school was knocked down to build the building that I now live in.
Wow.
And the view that I have is across the whole of London. So it's kind of a panoramic view, and I can see as far east as kind of Essex, where I went to school, and then as far west as kind of like Battersea, Chelsea, which was also where I went to school. And my room, as soon as I wake up, I can directly see Canary Wharf. And I often think, wow, the narrative I had when I was younger was, in order to pursue excellence, I needed to end up in Canary Wharf. And I think I dabbled in that for a bit, only to realize that that wasn't what success or excellence would mean to me. I think excellence would mean finding some level of parity that was similar, but represented excellence on my own terms. And I think the fact that I'm not working in Canary Wharf and looking over London from that perspective, but more so waking up and looking over London from that perspective, signifies to me that I've been able to carve my own path on my own terms and find some kind of semblance of coherence between the different components of my identity. But it is a very challenging process, and I think it is a very painful process to acknowledge these different components of your identity, because there aren't often structures or even language in place to acknowledge these different facets. Hence why I think people often compartmentalize or silo parts of their identity.
Hey everyone, I wanted to take one quick sec to talk about a new partner that I am so excited to announce I have on the show, an agency called Untapped. Untapped exists to put your brand in the world's pocket with beautifully crafted, high-impact mobile experiences. They've worked with brands like Barclays, EA Sports, American Express, and even the UK government. They're known for creating powerful apps with intuitive, seamless interactions that drive customer engagement and elevate brand recognition. But it isn't just tech development. Their expertise is bridging phenomenal quality technology with beautiful design to create the highest quality product possible that takes your users on a real journey with you. You may remember Will, the founder of Untapped, from episode 13 of the podcast. If you haven't heard that chat, I highly recommend it because it shows you what kind of no-nonsense, sleeves-rolled-up kind of people he and the team he's built really are, and it reflects in the kind of work that they do. They want to make their clients' work recognized across their industries and drive real game-changing value, something I've personally experienced and appreciated working with them myself. For businesses who want to take this next step in their journey, Untapped can help with everything from tech creation to brand design to product marketing and so much more. All right, the links are down below. Check it out. And now back to the episode. You're describing an integration of what someone might label as different parts of who you are. If all of those things are within you, are they not all who you are? We conceptualize them and compartmentalize them to, I think, make sense of them and describe them. I wonder how much, with your experience between the US and the UK, how much of this is a British problem? And I ask that because, or a British challenge, and I ask that because the British are very good at putting people into boxes culturally to describe them, right? you will have gotten the question loads, oh, where are you from? You're from East London. But people will ask you, and if you're white, they won't ask you that. Stuff like that. The British are just, their default mode is to box and compartmentalize people for their own sake. And then I think you adopt that because you're in a society and a culture that's doing that. And it sounds like that was a part of the challenge. Like that integration, what was it that made it so challenging to do the work, to do the integration? You say we didn't have language and tools. Why did you even need them in the first place? Like, why are those important?
So I'm thinking about the question of like, where are you from? In my experience, that hasn't really been a source of tension. Okay. That isn't really that hasn't been challenging. And I think I'm exposed to a lot of people from various backgrounds who are asked that question. And I've also been asked that question by, I think the most confusing version of that question I had was a few weeks ago when I was in Oxford. And, you know, my PhD project is looking at belonging and how people from various backgrounds cultivate a sense of belonging. So in some ways find coherence and integration. And I met a friend who is involved in my research project, and we were outside his college. And just as I said hello to my friend and, you know, we were about to head out, one of his friends, who happens to be the welfare officer at this college, walked up to me and said, and the first thing he said to me, he looked at me and he was like, where are you from? And I was like, and I looked at my friend who is of kind of Sri Lankan and I believe Trinidadian heritage. I looked over at him and I kind of was a bit like, I was a bit confused. And then I said, like, what do you mean? And he was like, oh, where are you from? And I said, I'm from London. And then I was like, is that kind of what you mean? And he was like, oh no, like where are you from? And I was like, what, is that the first question that you ask someone when you've just met them, where they're from? Like, is that what you ask before you even ask their name? And he was like, oh no, I'm sorry. And then he introduced himself and shared that he's from Nigeria. And he said that whenever he sees another black person, he just wants to know where they're from. And I was like, okay, well, I have Jamaican heritage on my grandparents' side, but I was born and raised in London. And I just kind of looked at him like, not feeling that. And then I went off with my friend and it kind of served as a helpful vignette to like start our interview, because we can often hear these narratives of white people asking people of color where they're from and that creating some tension. But in that moment, that was actually, I felt just as uncomfortable. And I think there was a frustration that bubbled up for both of us, and my friend apologized. He was like, I'm so sorry, I don't know why he asked that. And then we were laughing at how he's, like the irony of him being in the welfare team and yet asking like such a weird question, a question that we're often taught not to ask, especially if you're, you know, in a very conscientious role like welfare. And I just thought everyone's just on their own journey trying to figure out how they fit in, how they can relate to others. And so I think it's given me a level of empathy towards people when they ask the question, like, where are you from, more broadly. I don't take it, I think my version of that question is like, what's your heritage? Or where do you call home? And I think that's much more of an accurate question, because in Oxford, someone asking me where am I from, that could mean so many things. In the past, I've had people asking me that question because they've sensed that I have like an Americanized part of my identity, and they've wondered where that comes from. I've also had people ask me that question because they've wondered what part of the UK I'm from. I've also had people ask me that question because they've wondered what college I'm at. I've also had people ask me that question because they're just interested in forming some kind of bond, but perhaps they haven't thought critically about whether that's the most helpful or insightful question.
It's I feel like it's one of the examples of a cultural tool, and that tool has side effects. And I'm wondering if one of those side effects, at the very least, is this like siloing you're describing, and to what extent that siloing. To what extent what do we need to work on to overcome all the siloing that happens in our society? And let's just use this culture because we're here as an example. What do we need to do to overcome that, do you think?
So I think there are a couple of components. I think facades play a helpful role in protecting people. I think people can hide behind certain identities or versions of themselves because perhaps to confront the wider realities is too painful. And so these facades offer an escapism. And by facade, I mean by being able to ask a question that positions you as being part of the in-group, asking someone, for example, where are you from, can create a level of insider-outsider because it signifies that you are different from the two people are different, right?
Got you, yeah.
And so I think facades play a helpful role, but I think beyond the facades, there's often an element of insecurity. And I think what that guy was actually asking me is, do we share anything in common? So I think one way to bypass the siloing that we experience in the world is to stop with the facades. Not that it's an active, intentional process.
Yeah, it's very unconscious.
It's very unconscious. But I think ultimately we're trying to figure out what we have in common. We're trying to figure out who is our tribe, who relates to us, who understands our story, our struggle, who can appreciate and celebrate us, and perhaps who isn't going to do that, and therefore who should we stay away from. And I think what my PhD research so far has identified and highlighted is that everyone is just trying to find a sense of belonging. I think people do that in very insidious, harmful, violent ways. And by that, I mean the ways that they pursue belonging can have detrimental impacts on others. And then there's often a response which can then create even more animosity. But I think one of the ways to tackle the siloing is to explicitly ask, what do we have in common? Like, what do we share? Yesterday, for example, on my way home from Oxford, I saw this guy walk on the train and he had Salomons, which are now like my favorite shoe. And I was like, oh, I love the color, I love your colorway, I love your Salomon's colorway. And then he was like, oh, thank you. Yeah, they were some limited edition pair. I bought my first pair when I went hiking in Australia and I loved them so much. And then I bought another pair and they're the only shoes that I wear. And I was like, oh, same, these are the only shoes I wear now. I have so many pairs of trainers. And so it has always been quite rare for me to wear the same pair. And I think I didn't share this with him, but I think that's because I've always felt that I've needed to communicate that I'm different. That there are parts of my identity that change and shift. And I think that represents the broader thing that I've been trying to pursue and explore around what are the different components of my identity and how can I find ways to blend them. But going back to the conversation with this guy, I shared that, yeah, these are the only pair of shoes that I've worn consistently for probably longer than a week. Like, I wear these every day. I wear them when I go raving. I wear them to church. I wear them hiking. I wear them to work. I run in them in the gym. I wear them as a slip-on shoe when I'm running to the supermarket. And no other pair of shoes has been able to hold me in the same way and represent me. And I think that's quite powerful for a shoe to be able to do that. And so I think in brokering that conversation with him, it unlocked something really powerful. We then had conversation for the whole train ride home about his trip to Australia, this person that he's like visiting or who's visiting him from Australia. They're going to have like a romantic weekend. And then we shared a bit more about our PhD experience. He's just doing a PhD in mathematics. And then
all because of a pair of shoes.
All because of a pair of shoes. And then we spoke about where he's from, which is up north in Manchester. We spoke a little bit about accents. He said that I have a very neutral accent. And that was very interesting. We spoke a bit about that. And then we spoke about the music that he loves. He mentions that he loves like Hans Zimmer. And when he's doing mathematics, Hans Zimmer puts him in flow state. And I mentioned that it's quite varied for me. I can listen to anything from, contemporary worship music all the way through to intense amapiano. And it kind of depends on the energy that I need. And then we spoke about and then he invited me to go raving with him in the Oxford, in some Oxford forests. And I thought, wow, all of that just because I suppose explicitly I noticed something we had in common and I could lean into that. And lo and behold, it unlocked created this whole new realm for us to bond. Like, we go to the same university, yet we didn't really bond over that. We bonded over the fact that we wear the same shoes. And I think our society would perhaps respond to conflicts very differently if we could approach those conflicts from the lens of like, what do we have in common as opposed to why are we different?
What you're describing to me sounds like the courage to overcome the systems, the labels, the unconscious framing, and to ask questions that might seem unusual. I'm just going to ask you about your shoes. So some people, that's actually kind of terrifying. At least maybe that's like in like London where everyone's very in their own little thing. But what you're describing is really courage. The courage to take the facade down, the courage to take the mask off. How do we build that courage? And tying this into belonging, if we all want to belong somewhere and to do it meaningfully, we need courage. Then courage, how we build that is a essential component of building the life we seem to be, at least unconsciously, wanting to build.
Thank you. Because I think courage is actually a big component of my PhD topic. But I don't think I would have highlighted that straight away. I think what inspired me to do this research project was the courage that I observed in those students who came from underrepresented, underserved, and deprived backgrounds who were courageous enough to acknowledge their disadvantage, yet lean into it as opposed to hide away from it. And I realized that leaning into the disadvantage meant that it was on the table. It wasn't something they had to hide from or turn away from. It was more so something that they could acknowledge and then move past. It was kind of like the equivalent of them saying, oh yeah, we both have Salomons. What else do we have in common? Like, that's the starting point. And I think my research so far has shown me that the courage to claim space as your own when you don't feel represented, the courage to use humor as a way to level the playing field in moments where you might feel ostracized, those are all acts of courage. And I think courage comes from being able to accept the realities of your life and take it from there. I think we can, back to the point around facades, I think we can expend so much energy trying to hide or confiscate like parts of ourselves out of fear. But I think so much beauty can come from being courageous enough to ask someone what we have in common. And I think I've been doing this very actively and intentionally throughout my whole life, but I'd say more consciously over the last few weeks, where I've just met people. You know, my intention at the moment is to meet more people in the spaces where I frequent often. So, for example, you know, we can spend so much money on memberships for exclusive gyms or private members clubs, yet you can still go into those spaces and feel siloed and isolated and even lonely. And I often stop myself and think, wait, how does that make any sense? How can I justifiably spend X amount of money on a membership and not have met one new person in a month? No way. I'm clowning myself. That makes no sense. And I think that's my deepest fear, that I will have the things that I've been working so hard for to be in certain spaces and not be able to make the most out of those opportunities or spaces, or just be curious or courageous enough. So 2 weeks ago, on my way to the gym, I got to the reception and I chatted to my friend who's at the concierge, and I asked him if he's going to this queer rave that he actually told me about. He told me about it over Pride last year, but I didn't go. I had another party. And so there's another one coming up next month. And I asked him if he's going, and he was like, oh, I'm not sure. I'm going to these other things. And we chatted about those. And then he asked me where the party is that I'm going to. And I couldn't remember. I was like, oh, I think it's in East London. And then someone else who was ordering a smoothie, who had also seen at some queer raves in the past, but never spoken to. I'd also seen him in the gym, but never spoken to him. We'd literally, you know, done bench press right next to each other, danced next to each other, but never had a reason to speak, or I suppose never created a reason. And he chimed in and said, it was really interesting because when I was chatting to my friend at the concierge, I was kind of hoping that this other guy would chime in so that I could have a reason to, I suppose, bridge that gap, that awkward gap of like, I know I've seen you in so many different contexts, but we're kind of ignoring each other. So I was hoping that he would lean in, and he did, and he chimed in and said, oh, it's in Hackney Wick. And then we went in the lift together, and I asked him if he's going, and then we started speaking about how he spent his festive period. He said that he wanted to go to Berlin. He was planning to go to Berghain, but then he decided not to because he wanted to go to this, you know, cute. He wanted to rent a cute little hut with his, not hut, a cottage, with his boyfriend. So they did that instead, and then I picked up that he had a German accent, but I wasn't entirely sure. And so he asked me what I did, and I said I went to West Germany, spent it with my boyfriend and his family, and then he said, "Oh, I'm German as well," and he said that he's Chinese German, and I was like, "That's amazing." And I asked him where he grew up, and he said Dusseldorf, and I was like, when people say Dusseldorf, I think they might mean another place, and so I asked him. I was like, "Oh, where in Dusseldorf?" And then he was like, "Oh, I'm not sure if you've heard of it," and he lists this place that is exactly where my boyfriend's family live, this small little town. And we found out that we had that in common. It then went to a whole nother level where I found out that he went to the same school as my boyfriend, and I was like, no way.
Wow.
My boyfriend took me on a run to his school, and we went around all of the grounds. And I think that was this moment of removing those silos and in some ways figuring out what we share in common. Little did we know that we shared so much in common. And he's now working on a documentary filmmaking project, which is quite anthropological. And so how has that relationship now changed my experience of going to this members club and gym? It now means that I feel so much more comfortable and at home in this space because of how the space represents different parts of my identity. So it comes back to courage. It comes back to being courageous and maybe even humble enough to reach out to someone to explore what you share in common, knowing that you might not have anything in common. And the lowest common denominator might just be that you wear the same shoes, and that's enough.
You said a moment ago, we never created a reason to speak. Many people would say that we have a epidemic of loneliness right now. Maybe out of a fear of speaking or looking weird or something like that. And so we don't create those reasons to speak, but all speaking is because of a reason. All meeting people, all doing anything outside of your comfort zone is because of a reason. And I suppose we have our choices, right? The choice we can make to go and create the reason. I wonder if that means we need to learn to create reasons, or we need to relearn to create reasons, right? Because everything is so easily accessible on our phones. Dopamine is so easy to get. I don't need to create a reason anymore to talk to the person at the gym or whatever. And it feels like that's causing a lot of consequences. So that's a consequence that's causing more consequences, and it sort of spirals downwards into loneliness and isolation, and then we stop flexing those courage muscles. I wonder if it's as simple as go and try doing the thing. Because you need to recognize the value of doing the thing that we no longer seem to be programmed to do, right? We're social creatures, so we used to be programmed, and children are still like this, where they will just go and talk to people, right? Unless you train them otherwise. So I wonder if it's a retraining ourselves to be courageous enough to go start the thing, which means we have to start with an intentionality as well.
Wow. Yeah, I think it is.
In my head, I see it as like an equation, right? If I'm not happy with my results, maybe I feel lonely or like I don't belong, or I need directionality. Before directionality, you must have intentionality. And to set an intentionality, you must have an awareness that there's an intention you need or want to set in the first place. So we must go from awareness to intentionality to directionality. And then down that directionality, you rebuild that courage. That's challenging to start, though, right? We need to start somewhere, which I guess is that awareness. In your research and the work you've been doing, what often starts people down this process, right? If the process starts with awareness, if I don't feel quite right, if I feel a bit lonely and I don't know what to do, what starts me down my process of change? Hey, I just wanted to jump in here really quickly with an offer for you. Those of you who are a little newer to my work, which is most of you looking at the show's stats, will probably not know that for much of my career, I've been working with people to take more ownership of their lives as a coach, mentor, guide, and educator. This show exists to help people discover and cultivate their greatest inner leader. And that stems from a personal mission of mine. But what does it actually mean? Well, I break this down into 3 things: calm, confidence, and courage. We could all do with a little bit more, at least a little bit more, of all 3 of those things in our lives. But how do we make it happen? Well, that depends on us, on our temperament and our context, and so much more. So I've developed a free tool to help us understand 3 of the biggest things that I've noticed hold us back from those really powerful states to be in: restlessness, reactivity, and resistance. What I help folks do is move from that place into that place of calm, courage, and confidence instead. So you can use the link below to check that out. It's totally free, super simple, quick, and easy to use so that you can get just a little bit of clarity in that regard. And I created it just for this show because I noticed how important it was to overcome exactly those challenges. That's what the show is trying to help you do after all, so why not make it easy for you? So with all that being said, I really appreciate you. Hope you find that useful, and let's get back into this episode.
I've been doing CBT recently. I started in October, and I think after 3 years of intense psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapy, which got to the point where I was like, I want homework. I want things that I can like take away and work on and then come back and say, oh, this is what I've done. So I think after 3 years of psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapy, that I suppose got to some of the deep roots of some of the challenges that I was experiencing, I was ready to explore something that could focus a bit more on behavior change. And I realized that in December, I realized that I'd often share with people around me that I'd scroll on social media as a way of making sense of and processing all of my thoughts. And my CBT therapist shared that perhaps it's not about processing or making sense of, maybe you're numbing, the realities of those emotions that you're feeling. And initially I was a bit reticent and apprehensive to accept that perspective because it made me feel like my brain was smarter than me. And I was like, of course my brain's smarter than me. That feels a bit, my brain is me. But, I felt like my brain was doing something that I wasn't aware of. And then the more I've reflected on it and the more sessions I've had, I've realized that in moments where I feel very overwhelmed, my go-to is to scroll. And that's because I think I'm trying to numb the reality of all of these emotions. Whereas what I've since been doing is journaling straight away. So when I wake up in the morning now, and I used to journal every morning, but I wouldn't do it as the first thing. I'd often do it before I started working. So I'd wake up, scroll for a bit, then in some cases feel very paralyzing, like I couldn't leave my room because I was even more overwhelmed than I was before. And then I'd maybe go to the gym, eat breakfast, get ready, start working, and that's when I would journal. Whereas now the first thing I do is journal as soon as I wake up, turn off my alarm, then I journal. Don't look at my phone, I leave my phone on flight mode. And I journal for like 30 to 45 minutes every morning now. This morning I didn't want to stop. I was like, oh, why do I have to stop? I was just getting to the good parts.
Interesting.
And I think to answer your question, what's been really helpful is confronting my reality as opposed to running away from it. And I think that's what these students do. They confront their reality, confront the maybe let's say conflicting realities that they're experiencing, whether that's having to navigate growing up in a very, deprived family and perhaps living in really poor housing conditions, yet experiencing this opulence and affluence when they get to Oxford. And I think they don't numb that process, they lean into it. And I'd say that's quite similar to journaling, right? You're like confronting and making sense of all of these different realities that you experience in the moment. So yeah, I think a big part of my research is about courage, and it's the courage to lean in and confront as opposed to the fear of confronting, which can lead to numbing.
I guess that means the question is, how do we build greater courage? One of my past guests, I was chatting with her about this, and she said, you can feel unconfident and still do something courageous, which is a great way of summarizing that courage is really about action, not about feeling. So how do we build more courage when courage is action?
I think it's small steps. One book that's been really helpful, George actually introduced me to this book 5-6 years ago. And I was like, no, I'm not really in a place where I can consume productivity stuff. Like, going back to my earlier point, I need to focus on flattening these structures as opposed to building up this productivity piece, which would be at the detriment to understanding my queer identity. I couldn't articulate that 6 years ago, but I think that was the frustration I felt. But I'm now in a place where I can start to build all of these different components simultaneously. So I'm like, yeah, I feel very stable in this part of my life, in that part, in that part, in that part. I think I can now give some headspace to productivity because I'm building all of these things simultaneously. Like, I'm building these systems. So I've started reading, or I've nearly finished reading James Clear's Atomic Habits. And I think that book has really helped me because it's allowed me to break down the habit formation process into these 4 components. And James shares that if you start with, well, I'm simultaneously reading start with why as well. So I think in my brain, the two have conflated. So if I start with why, I can start with kind of why do I want the specific habit? What is the intention? And James speaks about the intention relating to your kind of identity change. Like, so who do you want to be? How do you want this habit to shape who you are as a person? And so if I start from the end, which is, okay, I want to be courageous. What steps can I take to get there? So James says that, if I remember correctly, it goes from identity change to goals, to systems, to atomic habits. So I work backwards. So if my identity is to be like a courageous person, what goals can I set? Okay, perhaps a goal is I need to meet one new person every time I go to the gym. Or have a conversation. Let's start with, I need to have a conversation with someone. What would the goal be? The goal could be, I need to meet someone / have a conversation with someone that I already know every time I go to the gym. And then you could say the systems that need to be in place for that are, I need to have enough time when I go to the gym so that I'm open-minded. I also need to make sure that I go to the gym. Like, I'm not going to meet anyone if I'm not there. And then I suppose the habit is making a conscious effort to look up and have conversations. So, for example, the conversation I had with my friend at the concierge meant that I could then meet someone new, which meant that I could find out that we share all of these things in common. So I think the steps to building courage involve breaking down the identity you want to form into goals, into systems, and then into atomic habits.
If we can decide we want to be a different person, because, like, if we had just met, you don't know who I am. I could be anyone. And often we're the ones assuming that we need to act the way we've always acted because we've given ourselves proof that that's who we are. So when you're describing that to me, I'm almost thinking, okay, if I want to be someone else, who would that person be? So if I want to be more courageous, how would that person show up? Let's assume I am that person. That person would go talk to the person, set that goal, and then on and on and on. And eventually that changes things habitually. So it's almost that courage to go, I'm going to be someone more courageous in the first place. I remember when I was 16, I was on like a youth program, and everyone else in the room, they were super inspiring, they were doing cool things. I was like, why am I in this room? I didn't feel like I deserved to be there. And one of the staff there, they kind of took me aside, and they were like, no one here knows who you are. You could be whoever you want to be. No one knows you do or don't deserve to be here. You're the one who's walked in with that predisposition, with that conception, that label for yourself. And it's almost like, okay, use a reverse engineering that a little bit. I can just decide who I want to be and act like that person. Now, I think there's a level of fake it till you make it in that, which I don't like. I don't love that saying.
Me neither.
I don't really I've never liked it, because if it's fake, then where is that truthful to you and who you are and what you want to create? I know that neurologically we can remove ourselves from who we are now and go, I want to be this person, so I'm going to start acting like that. And then one of my beliefs is we are our actions. So if we start acting like the person we want to be, we might just realize we've become them. And so it's ironic, like the courage to act more courageously starts you down this process of creating a life where you feel like you belong more so.
Absolutely.
In the work that you've done and what you've been looking into, where are we at when it comes to belonging and people's feelings of belonging. Brene Brown is my favorite author to turn to for stuff like this. I'm sure you're super familiar with her work, doing what you do. She described this as a crisis of belonging, right? Where many of us feel alone. Many of us are alone and feel lonely, which are two different things, but many of us actually feel both. Where we're all unconsciously looking for a need to belong, and so we polarize more. I don't feel like I belong to anyone, but the alt-right is really speaking to this one thing, and I can identify with that, and then that grows and grows. And the same thing with like the opposite extremes, and everything just gets more extreme, and everyone gets polarized, and identity politics, and we're just like, suddenly we're like, whoa, we're in a world of craziness and of people not being empathetic, not being understanding, communities break down, which is really ironic because all that process starts when we want to belong. So what are you seeing right now? Do you think it's as extreme as to say we have a crisis of belonging?
Yeah, I agree with Brene Brown. I think we have a crisis of belonging. But the challenge is belonging feels like too of an intimidating word to accept.
Okay.
Like for people to say, I don't belong here, I don't feel that I belong here. For those within our society who, let's say, we are taught to believe should belong, when those people don't feel that they belong, I think that is very intimidating to acknowledge.
As in, we are taught we should belong somewhere.
We are taught that we should belong somewhere. We are also taught that there are certain members of society who should inherently feel that they belong in certain spaces.
Okay.
And I think it is very confronting and scary to acknowledge that no one feels that they belong. And I think perhaps what we're experiencing in the world is the reality of this crisis of belonging, where perhaps the wealthiest, most influential and powerful people in the world seem to be the ones who are also making this notion of belonging much more inaccessible for those who are not in the same position as them. And I think perhaps that can give us some insight into this crisis of belonging, because it's like, wait, how does it make sense that those with the most power, money, and influence are focused on elements of let's say creating lines and boundaries around who is in and who is out? How can they be so focused on that? What does that tell us? What insights can that give us into where we are at the moment? And I'd say it perhaps speaks to Brene Brown's point about this crisis of belonging, like who actually belongs, and what does it take to belong? I think my research so far has shown me that money, power, and influence aren't necessarily key factors for belonging.
So what are the key factors?
You have to come back to me in 4 years.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe not 4 years, but I think courage is one of them.
Okay.
Courage and humility are definitely two components.
Humility as well. Okay.
Yeah.
Where does humility play in?
I think humility plays in because humility allows us to recognize that our courage might not yield any results. We might reach out to someone, we might try and explore what we have in common, and we might be rejected. We might be ostracized. We might be discouraged. We might be made to feel that we are weird or strange or different. I think humility allows us to accept that that's a possibility and keep moving. Of course, it will have an impact on you, but I think humility allows us to reduce the impact it can have.
That's really interesting. One of the things that Brene describes, which I would, in my own words, describe as zooming in. So the zoomed in versus the zoomed out perspective, that most of us live in the zoomed out perspective, right? Strangers are exactly that. They're strangers. They're separate. There's a separateness. There's an otherness, as you say. And zooming in helps overcome this separation. So the way I describe it is, like, I have a practical little exercise I do, which is sort of an empathy exercise, I guess, where it comes from the term that empathy made popular, which is like put yourself in someone else's shoes. So sometimes I visualize my brain going into someone else's brain, sitting there with their body, their facial expression, their heart pumping blood through their body, and just going, would I have the same body language they have? Would I do the same thing, like bump into someone and not say sorry, especially if someone, like, you know, is like, I don't know, rude to you on the street or whatever. It's like that practice of moving in. If you were in their body, would you do the same thing? And the answer is most likely, because they're doing it, right? And it's just this, like, you're zooming into someone. You can therefore understand that you're not as separate from them as you unconsciously think you are.
Yeah. I often think that conflicts are really fascinating, because conflicts turn people from strangers into relating to one another. And we can think about it in very accessible ways through the lens of, to your point, someone barging into someone else on a train. Like, you've changed from being strangers who take the same train to people who are now conversing with one another, which is quite a powerful way of relating. You're having a conversation, quite an emotional or an emotive one. And I'm interested in what you do with those emotions. Typically, those emotions can lead to people being so enraged that they want to fight, or they rally others on the train who are just as angry or frustrated as them. And then you've created a community all from, this encounter. And I often think, what would happen if just after that rage, they hugged? What would happen? Like, how would that change how they perceive one another or relate to one another? They probably know each other better than maybe some of the people that they live with, because they've had a very emotive encounter and they've met each other at their rawest form.
That's a really
And I
good
often
point.
think, like, wow, what would happen if they then became friends? I wonder what kind of friendship they would have.
You know what you're talking to, which is something I skipped over earlier, which is maybe an extra piece of this equation, which is curiosity. I must have the curiosity to want to go do the thing, to ask the question, to meet the person. If I have absolutely no curiosity, I'm not motivated enough, I've got no trigger to go and do the asking of the hard questions and the putting myself out of the comfort zone. What you're describing is a curiosity, right? Oh, I wonder what would happen if, we were angry, but maybe we have more in common than we thought. Curiosity, right? Maybe there's a reason the world brought us together doing this. Curiosity. This thing you said earlier of, like, you wanted, almost like unconsciously wanted a reason to speak to this person you had done bench presses next to and had never spoken to. It's like, why? Well, because you had curiosity. It feels like that's a fundamental part of this too.
Yeah, curious. I was curious to know what we had in common. I knew that we were. Oh, he also wears Salomons.
A third person. The world is trying to pull you to people with that. Clearly,
and I was just curious to know. Oh, I wonder what else we have in common. I'd seen him at the same parties. We go to the same gym. I then found out that we have like 10 mutual friends. He grew up in the same place as my boyfriend, and he went to the same school as my boyfriend. And that's in a very small town in West Germany. Yet we find ourselves at this members club in East London.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really powerful. And I'm really interested in how we can carve out more moments for that. I don't think it's about having a framework. I think that can become very roboticized. I think it's more so about being curious and open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
There's no framework. Like the other day, I was chatting to someone who I was at this retreat in Berlin over New Year's, and I facilitated a play fighting workshop. And I realized that play fighting is in some ways an opportunity not to win or to figure out who's stronger, but more so to relate to people and be curious and to find like harmony.
What did that involve? Like, so what is play fighting? What is it? What does that
Yeah,
mean
it was
in this
my first
context?
time.
Okay.
It was being very physical and aggressive without having a goal.
Okay.
Yeah, so it started off as a dance where I asked two of the participants to kind of have their back facing each other, and then they had to close their eyes and lean against each other, and then almost like start this movement practice, and then they just had to slowly. I didn't give them much instruction. I just said, then from there, start play fighting, and that meant that there were lots of like people being pinned down, but then having a dialogue like, okay, like when one person pinned the other person down, the person on top would say, okay, try and get out of this. And then the other person would try and wrestle out of it. And then they would say, okay, I can't, can you let me go now? And then they'd like roll over and swap. And I found that a really powerful exercise, because when in society when in our lives do we have an opportunity to say to the oppressor, so to speak, like, okay, I've tried to get out of this, I can't, can you let me go now? And the oppressor's like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You like roll over and then you pin down the oppressor and then repeat the same thing. Like, when does that exist? So it was part like fantasy, right? Like, how do you create a fantasy where that is
Interesting.
a possibility? And how do you create a reality where people are not trying to win, not trying to overpower one another? For example, when I demoed with someone, he was very keen on just like trying to win. And then I said, no, this is not about winning. This is about, if you push me, don't just push me and stay where you are. Push me and lean into it as well. So follow me as you push me. And I think that was just a really powerful way I got to know so much about him, and it unlocked so many other conversations. And he was like, yeah, this is so interesting, because in my life and in my work, I very rarely have the opportunity to take my foot off the gas. I always have to be the one in control. And this offered an opportunity where I could safely not be in control.
I need to wrap us up for time. There's so many more things we could ask, and I feel like this could go in so many directions. I really appreciated this. I have a closing question I ask everyone who comes on the show. The show is called Lost in Searching. So, Isaiah, I'd love to know, what is the biggest question in your life that you are still searching for the answer to right now?
Who's Isaiah?
Mm.
That's the question that I'm still finding the answer to.
Where have you gotten to so far?
So far, I like him. I think he's a cool, interesting, curious, courageous person. I think he's also in a very stable place in his life right now, which is really powerful to see. I think he's going through he has some big questions about the kind of work that he'd like to do moving forward. And I think he's getting some answers to those questions, even in this podcast.
Beautiful.
But that's the question I want to continue asking myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who are you?
Mm.
And I love being able to discover that.
I like to wrap things up always by saying that life is an evolving journey of discovery. And that's a question that will evolve as you do, and will to some extent be with you maybe your whole life, which is, I think, really beautiful, because we do change and we do always discover new things about us. You can be 80 and discover something new about yourself, you know? So I think that's a really beautiful sentiment. Thank you so much for sharing. It's been a great show, and I really appreciate you for sharing and for giving us a sneak peek into your PhD research too, and all these cool things. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Alrighty, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. I hope you found it valuable. We've reached a number of really important milestones on this show already. It's only been a couple of months, but I'm so grateful to those of you who not only subscribe, but also who listen this far along, who leave the comments on posts, or who give me really powerful, beautiful messages in response. It's been a humbling journey, and there is so much more to come. If there's something about this episode and the question that we answered, or any of the learnings that you took away that you want to make sure someone else you know understands themselves, then please do share this episode with them, along with your reflections, teaching other people something that you learned, passing the information on, or even just writing it down for yourself. All help you retain the answers to this, and any inspiration it gave you even more. That's the purpose of all this, is to give you as much positive, powerful, impactful results as possible on your journey to developing your own inner leader from so many different dimensions, not just the one we've talked about today. So thank you so much for being here, sending lots of love, and here's to your success.